Welcome back to our series on your church and Bitcoin. We took a deep dive into the morals and ethics of Bitcoin in the previous talk, showing that it isn't in fact evil. So now we're going to look at some of the challenges and potential risks to Bitcoin. For example, one of the most common objections you might hear is that the government will eventually just ban Bitcoin or seize it, or at least tax it into oblivion. So is Bitcoin really vulnerable to the government? The answer is yes, but the results of government interference may be surprising to you. Governments around the world have attempted to ban Bitcoin, but not governments everywhere all at once. For example, China famously banned Bitcoin mining in 2021, but that didn't kill Bitcoin. The net effect was that the epicenter of global hash rate shifted to the United States, where mining was still legal. As we enter into the era of nation-state adoption, many theorize there will be a global hash war, meaning countries will attempt to provide the most hash rate or raw power to the Bitcoin mining network in order to reap the most benefits from the protocol and accumulate the most Bitcoin. If this comes true, China's decision could prove to be one of the costliest blunders in modern warfare. It's true that the price of Bitcoin took a hit after the Chinese mining ban, but there were many other factors that probably contributed to that price action, not the least of which were the scandals like FTX and the 4-year halving cycle, which is the predefined reduction in Bitcoin supply issuance from mining. The point is the ban didn't kill Bitcoin, and in hindsight, the price hit was just a temporary setback in the context of the new all-time highs of late 2024. And while it's theoretically possible that Bitcoin could be banned everywhere all at once, this is about as likely as the internet or power grid going down across the globe and staying that way indefinitely. And even if governments were able to coordinate such an attack, it's unlikely that 100% of citizens in every country would choose to comply. On non-compliance in the Bible, think Gideon from Judges 6, where he beat out the wheat in secret to hide it from the Midianites, or even the Hebrew midwives in Exodus 1 who refused to comply with Pharaoh's order to kill all the male children. The fact is, Bitcoin is a decentralized protocol, and copies of the blockchain are hosted by ordinary people around the world in every country, and this makes it effectively impossible to ban, as every single person running a node would have to be found out and shut down simultaneously. The governments of the world are powerful, but they're not omnipotent nor omnipresent. And with many nation-states announcing plans to launch strategic Bitcoin reserves, including the United States, this objection gets even more far-fetched as time goes on. But what about the idea of seizure? Honestly, governments do have a history of seizing Bitcoin and other assets like gold for that matter, and this is what Bitcoiners call a 6102 attack, a reference to FDR's executive order in 1933 and the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which forced Americans to relinquish their gold under penalty of law. Given this precedent, it's appropriate to fear government seizure of Bitcoin, and this is why fighting to keep Bitcoin decentralized and in self-custody is so important. With many people now buying Bitcoin through ETFs, most of which currently use Coinbase to actually custody the Bitcoin, there is a credible threat where the U.S. government could seize a sizable amount of Bitcoin from Coinbase. Of course, this type of seizure isn't a threat to Bitcoin in general, but rather just to people that don't practice self-custody. And if the U.S. did decide to take such action, it would probably be to maintain power and wealth, not to destroy Bitcoin, because unlike other cryptocurrencies which use proof of stake, holding more Bitcoin doesn't give you any more or less control over the network, but we'll discuss this more in detail shortly. The final flavor of this objection, the idea that governments will tax or regulate it into oblivion, has some validity, as even now in early 2025, Bitcoin doesn't receive the most equitable tax treatment in many developed countries. For example, the United States taxes Bitcoin like property, which means that any buying or selling or even transacting falls under capital gains tax law. If you're buying and holding or hodling, this doesn't present much of an issue, but if you want to use Bitcoin transactionally on a daily basis, this creates an onerous and often impossible level of accounting to track all the potential gains and losses to report at the end of the year for capital gains taxes. It's possible that governments could go further and institute policies like unrealized capital gains taxes, but it's also becoming more and more likely that Bitcoin will instead be treated as any other currency, and this will pave the way for using it as a medium of exchange, as onerous capital gains accounting will no longer apply. Only time will tell what the future holds, and there are plenty of countries that already treat Bitcoin favorably, and even as legal tender. In a future where Bitcoin is the global reserve currency, Countries will have to compete for productive citizens just like they compete for hash rate and owning Bitcoin directly. For more details on the risk of governments banning Bitcoin, read Chapter 26 in Broken Money by Lynn Alden and Chapter 11 in Gradually Then Suddenly by Parker Lewis. So if Bitcoin isn't vulnerable to the government, does that mean it undermines the government's authority to coin money? For example, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution of the United States gives the government the right to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and fix the standard of weights and measures. The answer is no. The government maintains the power to declare what is legal tender, or in other words, what can be used to pay debts both public and private, and to pay taxes. In the case of the United States, this is of course the US dollar, and Bitcoin cannot and does not have control over this. The U.S. government has already classified Bitcoin as property, at least from a tax standpoint, and this means it's legal to own and trade. Again, this is specific to the United States at the time of this recording, and your mileage may vary if you live elsewhere, so please be careful to understand and obey all the local laws and regulations in your jurisdiction. And of course, be sure to pay your taxes in the currency that your government requires. If Bitcoin can help you do this, great. But what about the idea that Bitcoin weakens fiat currencies, which thereby weakens the governments that issue them, which in turn undermines their power and authority? The argument is that even though Bitcoin doesn't claim to be legal tender, many have already accepted it as money, and when they sell their fiat currencies to buy it, those currencies suffer while Bitcoin continues to appreciate. Granted, this is the situation for most, if not all, fiat currencies, but I would argue this is actually victim blaming. The reality is that it's governments that voluntarily choose to debase their currencies by maintaining reckless fiscal and monetary policies such as endless deficit spending, which is fueled by bond purchases from central banks that create the money out of thin air. Then, to add fuel to the fire, governments license banks that practice in unethical practices such as fractional reserve banking, where banks loan out demand deposits. Contractually, bank customers have the right to demand repayment of such deposits at any time without warning. And this has led to countless insolvencies and bank runs, which then cause the government to print even more money to bail out the banks. All of this activity increases the money supply, which is the true cause of the inflation that ultimately motivates people to sell fiat for Bitcoin. Yes, this selling does put further downward pressure on fiat currencies, but the same argument can be made for any asset class that people monetize as an inflation hedge, such as real estate, gold, or art. To paraphrase Ludwig von Mises, inflation is not a random or spontaneous event, but rather the consequence of a deliberate policy, and the end result is the loss of purchasing power, which is effectively the same as theft. And even if this is a government policy, that doesn't make it just. The Bible expects us to be prudent and wise with our wealth, and using inflation hedges, Bitcoin or otherwise, is a natural and sad consequence of the fiat system in which we live. For more details on inflation and how the financial system and fiat currencies actually work, read chapters 14 and 15 in Broken Money. So what about more personal risks? For example, can't Bitcoin be easily lost or stolen? The media loves to publicize stories about early adopters that threw away hard drives with thousands of Bitcoin, and now they spend their days combing through heaps of trash in landfills. Some estimates even claim that over 1 million Bitcoin have been lost forever. It's undeniable that Bitcoin has been lost, but the question really boils down to, is it any easier or harder to lose Bitcoin relative to other bearer assets such as gold? In the most basic case, holding Bitcoin means writing down 12 words or stamping these words into a fireproof metal plate, which can be stored in a safe or a safety deposit box, just like gold coins. If you go the metal plate route, it's actually nearly impossible to destroy the information without melting it down. And so in reality, the custody situation is very similar to that of gold or any other monetary metal. Most of the famous cases of lost Bitcoin come down to the bearer not really understanding the value, or more likely, the potential future value of the asset. And so they were careless with it, or they literally forgot about it and threw it away. At this point, with Bitcoin trading around 100,000, I think everyone is well aware of the value, and there are plenty of custodial and non-custodial solutions that make losing Bitcoin extremely unlikely. Theft is actually a far bigger threat, and if you take self-custody of your Bitcoin, you may be susceptible to a $5 wrench attack. That is, the idea that someone could threaten to kill you with a $5 wrench if you don't hand over your 12 words. Even this is still very unlikely, but there are rare examples of this happening. So as the price of Bitcoin goes up, and if people know you may have Bitcoin, it's prudent to take steps to defend against this threat. If you're into self-custody, one of the best ways to handle this is using a multi-sig wallet, which just means it requires more than one key or set of words to send your Bitcoin. We'll discuss different custody options in a later video, but for now, it's enough to know that there are options, and there are plenty of companies that can help you think through and even do collaborative custody for you. In the end, Bitcoin is still part of this world, and we need to heed Jesus' warning from Matthew 6:19 through 21, which says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So even if you agree with everything up to this point, you may still be thinking, Bitcoin is just too complicated. How can I invest in something I don't understand? After all, this is exactly how Warren Buffett feels, one of the most successful investors of the last 50 years. Buffett famously said that he only invests in companies that he thoroughly researches and understands. Given his success rate, it's understandable that many follow his advice almost religiously. But in the case of Bitcoin, few actually have spent the time to research it. Most people assume that spending time researching Bitcoin will prove fruitless because they're non-technical or don't have a degree in computer science or economics. It's true that understanding every line of Bitcoin's code is probably out of reach for most people, but like any complex system, there are many layers and levels of abstraction that are accessible, regardless of your background or intelligence level. And you don't really have to understand all these complexities to use Bitcoin, but that's not really the objection here. Let me explain. Take our banking system and fiat currency in the United States, for example. Few people actually understand how banks function, or where dollars come from, or what the Federal Reserve is, but that doesn't really stop anyone from using dollars in banks. After all, we've grown up in this system and it seems familiar and convenient. Most of the time, it just works. Now, if you've actually tried to research these topics, you know just how convoluted and complicated this system actually is, and by comparison, Bitcoin almost seems too simple. Not from a technical standpoint, but more so from an economics perspective. I think the real objection here stems from the fact that most people place an incredible amount of implicit trust in the current system while holding Bitcoin to a different standard. Bitcoin is relatively new, and it does take time for people to trust new systems, but it's also overtly technical because of popular labels such as cryptocurrency, which leads people to believe that they must understand esoteric concepts like cryptography in order to understand Bitcoin. What you may not realize is that cryptography also underpins the security of the banking system and really all of our modern communication and financial systems. But again, lack of understanding about how these systems work doesn't stop anyone from using them because it's really all based on trust. Furthermore, I believe the original question incorrectly frames the entire conversation by categorizing Bitcoin as an investment as opposed to an alternate monetary system. We agree that you should try to understand any investment you make, and that you should also build trust in any monetary system that you choose to participate in, but these are two very different things that shouldn't be conflated. Bitcoin isn't a company that has a CEO, a balance sheet, or cash flows, and trying to research and understand it by these metrics is nonsensical. Instead, start with the assumption that Bitcoin is digital money that promotes human freedom, and compare it in like kind to other types of money and markets that you are more familiar with. And don't sell yourself short. You don't need a computer science degree to understand and use Bitcoin, or even take self-custody. But you also don't have to start at self-custody either. We're in a golden age of high-quality content on Bitcoin, and we've done much of the heavy lifting for you by bookmarking some of the best books, videos, and podcasts that we've encountered over the years, and they're all available in the Google Doc linked in the description. The document links to resources at almost every layer of abstraction, and we're confident that anyone can understand Bitcoin at a meaningful enough level to develop trust and conviction to participate. I'll mention a few of our favorite resources now. If you're into books and want to start with a non-technical overview of both the fiat system and Bitcoin, read Broken Money by Lynn Alden or The Bitcoin Standard by Seyfedine Ammous. If you prefer shorter form content, check out Matthew Kreider's YouTube channel called Bitcoin University. And if you're really looking for a good technical primer, start with 3 Blue 1 Brown's video called But How Does Bitcoin Actually Work? So if Bitcoin isn't an investment, what is it?